The evolution of Goku's design. It's been a long time since I've done a video on Toriyama and breaking down his art style. I have discussed it here and there throughout some videos, but it usually wasn't the main topic. So getting to do a video just solely dedicated to that one subject really makes me happy, and the last time I probably did this was the evolution of Toriyama's art style. My very first video on this channel, which was well over a year ago, and one that I particularly remembered I enjoyed. So let's start and get to the topic at hand. So starting with Goku's first appearance in manga form was in Weekly Shonen Jump, December 3rd, 1984. So starting with chapter 1, you have to keep in mind the last chapter of Dr. Slump had only just finished in September 10th, 1984, so Toriyama still retained the very rounded art style. And one of the biggest things that changed in Goku's design later is the hair. You will notice in the early days, instead of curving outward, then hanging down, it actually spiked directly up. And of course, Toriyama wouldn't draw it the same every single time. Here, a couple of pages earlier, it looks a little more closer to what we are familiar with his hair hanging down, but usually it was drawn very spiky at this time, usually flicking upwards on both sides. He was also drawn with sometimes 6 spikes on the left side of the hair, which again is something, not always in every single panel. Sometimes it might be 4, or most of the time it was 5, but it was a feature you would see a fair amount throughout the early chapters. And another large difference is the parting in the middle, which was quite large to how it was later in the series, where it gradually became smaller, but also the position being in the middle instead of off to the side. The clumps of hair itself are also very rounded. Goku was also very short at this time and had somewhat skinny arms in proportion to his head, and to define muscles, Toriyama would usually use just a simple rounded pen stroke. Goku's eyes were basically just half circles with a couple little pen strokes underneath drawn in a wavy motion. Ears were also very rounded but not particularly large, and his nose was defined by this little quarter circle. Eyebrows are usually placed well above the eyes in a sort of oval, drawn somewhat thin with a little variation of width, and his jaw and head was drawn fairly rounded. And throughout the following chapters, he's drawn pretty much exactly the same with all the features I've mentioned so far. However, you can notice Goku's head in early chapters is quite large in proportion to his body, and the proportions could vary a little page to page. For example, both these panels are from the same chapter. Now, about around chapter 15 of the manga is when I started to notice some small changes in regards to proportions, with the head being just that bit smaller, but also Goku looking a little more bulk and less chubbier than early chapters, and is now the look of his design for future chapters. Small note, this chapter was also released in January 4th, 1985, so it's been exactly a month or so since Toriyama has been writing Dragon Ball. But in chapter 24 and 25 is when you first start ever noticing some major changes in the way he draws Goku. In regards to the hairstyle, which I noticed has started to change a little more by curving down more often, but as I said, more often because not every single panel instantly features a completely different hairstyle all of a sudden, but you can notice a small gradual shift throughout this chapter, because then literally a couple of panels later it's up again, and you can notice the same thing in this page too. And also this page I grabbed a panel from chapter 11 for comparison, and I thought, wow, look how different it looks. This proves that there's definitely some change. But then I found a picture from the next chapter and compared it, and he looks literally the same. But as I said, it is ever so gradual in this chapter. But in the next one, chapter 25, you can notice some clear changes, and throughout this chapter his hairstyle is drawn almost always now hanging down, and this one here looks actually quite modern with the less hair spikes and being more sharp overall. But yes, looking at the pages, you can notice some of the first changes in the way Goku is drawn in regards to his hairstyle. And now continuing into chapter 27 and 28, there are already some more slight changes with his hair, already with less spikes being utilized, limiting down to 4 or even 3 here and there. But also his hair is drawn longer, and I think there is enough of a consistent change throughout these chapters to show a clear comparison now of how Goku is already starting to look different. Now skip to the first Tenkaichi Budokai, and in the preliminary rounds there is next to no change, but a little later when he is fighting Jackie Chan, he is drawn slightly taller, and Toriyama does make note in an interview from 2015 that his head/body ratio made fighting hard. So I said that if the series was going to start focusing more on battles, then I needed to make him an adult. And so although this explains more so to why he made him grow up later on, it also does explain as to why he started to draw him slightly more taller in this battle. And into the Red Ribbon Army arc, his design remains pretty much the same to the way he looked in the early chapters as discussed, such as the ones meeting Krillin, and even earlier chapters, with the small exception of a hairstyle change and being ever so slightly taller. And of course his hairstyle might fluctuate in chapters, but his design was pretty consistent, especially in regards to the face. For example, here is a panel I showed before from chapter 1 and one from the General Blue saga. But when getting to chapter 78, published in January 10th, 1986, so a good year forward, you can start to see that his ears are starting to be drawn slightly larger now. Now, of course, like the hair, it could fluctuate. For example, the picture on the right is from chapter 76, and the one on the left is from the previous chapter 75. But throughout this chapter 78, there was a consistent change. And I guess when looking back at 75, as I just showed, you can see a small change seeping through here and there in some panels. And from this point on, they were consistently drawn larger in future chapters. Now when we get to chapter 93, this panel specifically caught my eye. Goku's pupils are larger, however this is something done when he is angry, not all the time but usually for close-ups, but his eyebrows are also, I feel, just a bit more thicker and defined, and also he has very large ears compared to the size they are usually drawn, and overall with those several small style changes, it does provide a little view into how he would be drawn standard in the future. Now once we get to the Tien Shinhan saga, you can notice a small difference in chapter 113, but you get this cool little throwback I never actually noticed until now, but more so you can also notice the height difference, and his hair also flicks longer out the sides, and of course you'd have one of those one-off panels in a chapter, for example, such as this one here where it'd be really long, but it wasn't consistent and was usually shorter than it is depicted here. And with the right side, instead of flicking upwards, it just hangs down from his head. Now, with Goku's hairstyle, as I said before, it would fluctuate, but generally, as I mentioned, from around chapter 27 onwards, sometimes it would kind of just spike out to the side, and sometimes it would flick down. And the length would change a bit from panel to panel, but in this current arc, his hairstyle overall is drawn flicking down a lot more often and is longer overall, making it look a little more familiar to how he would look later on. And on a side note, I guess you could say that he definitely isn't drawn as deformed and chubby anymore. Now on to chapter 115, released 10th of March 1987, so a couple months shy of 1 year, and if you observe and compare to earlier chapters, you can see that his head is drawn more blockier, and I guess a little more sharper regarding the jawline. Now his face was drawn sharp and very similar throughout previous chapters to this one, but it was something a little inconsistent, just like the hair. It could fluctuate between panels and chapters, etc., but overall it was usually rounded, and I noticed a more consistent change throughout the Fortune Teller Barber arc, and again, it wasn't the same every single time, but you could still notice the difference in his style slowly changing, and however, it is very consistently drawn sharper and narrower, whether he is happy or angry, because it did seem that if Goku was angry sometimes, he would draw his face more angular. Again, not every time, but it was fairly common. And in later chapters in 129, you can see just how angular and different Toriyama draws his face here, with the large ears and large pupils, although take note that his line work itself, though, is still quite rounded, and overall it really reminds me of early Dragon Ball Z. But getting a little further into chapter 136, when Goku faces Tambourine, there are some more changes, with this panel really feeling like something out of the Saiyan arc. Now, first off, there is extra details to his eyebrows. The lines underneath his eyes are just curves instead of the wavy motion you would usually see. His pupils are also not a solid black and are slightly whited out. His hair is also spiked directly up, which I believe is also a first in the series, well, except chapter 135, and there are several veins popping out. Then the following panel in regards to Goku's face is drawn very sharply, and even the line work for his clothes seems to be a little more sharper than usual. And in another panel, he draws his hair not only still spiking out, but very long overall, and you just see how much more expression Toriyama has given Goku in these panels, but once again, some little features that would recur in later chapters. And by around 138, you notice his ears being drawn slightly larger again, and is overall drawn very consistently larger, especially in chapter 142 from then on, and later on, near the end of the battle with Goku and King Piccolo, they get even larger in some panels here and there. In further chapters such as 143, you can still see Goku's design expounding further on what I've just mentioned, and also Toriyama would draw more angular for more serious scenes, but regardless, when looking back at a good swath of chapters like 103 or even back to 99 or even the previous arc, you can see the reduction of the curvature around the side of the jaw here being almost non-existing. And on a side note, Masaki Saito was the best, especially in this arc, of capturing Toriyama's style. I heard the term the manga coming to life when discussing DBS Broly, but in reality, Saito was the real one who brought the manga to life long ago in my opinion. The large pupils, thick eyebrows, line work variation / line variation, shading beneath the chin, and even the hair, etc. was just like Toriyama's. And now finally onto adult Goku in 166. So obviously for one, he is a lot taller and is more bulky. Differences in the face are larger pupils, which are included here and there for a serious moment, but are now standard. His nose is also like a little triangle, or hill I guess you could say, with a curved line rising above it, unlike the little quarter circle he had before. The way he draws his eyes and eyebrows are still the same overall, except for making the ears come out just a little further width-wise. Also his jawline, especially on a side angle, would curve, and often the jawline would come up a little past the tip of his ear. And his jawline slash head isn't as wide as it used to be, and is longer vertically. And a small style note is how the line work for the jawline starts to curve slightly instead of being rounded like it was for so long. But the chubby look to his face does kind of surface here and there with this picture here, with being somewhat reminiscent of the earlier chapters with that more rounded look to the jaw, but overall it is on its way out. Front on, it's pretty much the same as the previous arc in regards to dimensions, and his hand, unlike before, isn't so chubby and rounded. Line work for clothing is pretty much the same as recent chapters. In regard to his hairstyle, I think it's just that extra bit longer out the sides. His ears in further chapters changes a little bit, just being that little less rounded, and in later chapters 191 changes again, but isn't consistent enough that it looks completely different. But you can see his style slowly changing again. And as usual, he still likes to draw more sharper with fighting scenes, but as you can see, his line work has started to get even more sharper again, and especially with the clothing. And I guess a good visual representation of this is that his clothes before were kind of like little clouds or ovals, I guess you could say, and now they're kind of more like box shapes. But yeah, in the later chapters, that classic Z look we are so familiar with starts to begin to emerge, and overall I don't see any major changes besides those ones in this time period. So let's now skip to chapter 195, which was the start of Dragon Ball Z and the anime adaptation, because if you didn't know, there was no Dragon Ball Z manga. That term was just purely used for the television series, although Viz did chuck the Z on for the English release if you are feeling a little confused. The only appearance he makes actually in the manga is just as a baby, but Toriyama still draws Goku very rounded like he did in the first chapter, although the hairstyle obviously is different and looks more like from how it was drawn in the Tien Shinhan arc, and has the angular look of the previous arc. And finally on to adult Goku in chapter 196, and comparing to several chapters back being 179, and there are some major differences. For example, the jawline actually dips in slightly, and so do the sides of his head, which itself is overall slightly more narrower, and the line work itself is more sharper again, with no round curves really around the jawline here. And this change isn't just a one-off, it is fairly consistent, and his arms are more bulk, and his eyes, instead of being that quarter circle, are more like, I guess, a hook with a line underneath. Ears are kind of the same compared to the previous arc, and are still kind of inconsistent, but still retain that rounded overlook for the most part, just like kind of in the previous tournament, although especially when Goku's angry, they are more angular. Also, things like clothing, especially in this picture, look exactly the same with the somewhat still rounded line work. However, in future chapters, which I'll get into discussing in a part 2, that kind of changes quickly. So as always, I appreciate you watching this video on documenting the changes in Goku's design over the years, and for sticking around to the end. Hopefully in the next part 2 in the future, I'll be able to cover the rest of Z and into Nico Margin Z, but who knows, I might have to split it even into a part 3. And I'll also continue this series onto other characters like Vegeta, who should be much easier since he isn't in the series from the start like Goku. So yeah, and the next video might be some art videos, and possibly another video topic discussing why a lot of modern day anime's art styles feel plastic. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you soon.